It started with the sirens. I was in the middle of making coffee when the first one went off. A sharp, ear-piercing wail that cut through the quiet of my small rural town. I froze, the coffee pot hovering in midair as the sound echoed through the streets. It wasn't the usual fire alarm or the occasional test of the emergency system. This was different. This was urgent. I set the coffee pot down and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains. The sun was just rising, casting a pale golden light over the empty streets. Everything looked normal. No smoke, no fire trucks, no crowds gathering. Just the same sleepy town I'd lived in for years. But the sirens kept blaring, their shrill, insistent tone growing louder and more frantic. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I grabbed it, expecting an explanation. Instead, I was met with a stark, glaring message. Emergency alert. Severe weather warning. Take shelter immediately. Avoid windows and doors. Stay tuned for updates. National Weather Service. I frowned. Severe weather? The sky outside was clear, not a cloud in sight. I'd lived in this town long enough to know when a storm was coming, and this wasn't it. The air was calm, the kind of calm that usually meant a hot, uneventful day. I opened the weather app on my phone, but it showed nothing. No storms, no warnings, no alerts. Just a sunny forecast for the next week. Confused, I called my friend Mark, who worked at the local news station. "Hey, did you guys issue that weather alert?" I asked, as soon as he picked up.
What alert?
He replied, sounding just as confused as I was. The one about severe weather. The sirens are going off and I got an emergency alert. There was a pause on the other end of the line.
We didn't issue anything. Are you sure it's from us?
It says National Weather Service, I said, double-checking the message. But there's no storm. Nothing on the radar. Mark hesitated.
That's weird. Let me check with the team and get back to you.
I hung up and stared at my phone, the sirens still blaring in the background. They were relentless, a constant, deafening roar that made it hard to think. I walked back to the window, peering out again. Still nothing. No one was outside, no cars were moving. It was as if the entire town had gone into hiding. Then, my phone buzzed again. Another alert. Emergency alert. Tornado warning in effect. Seek shelter immediately. This is not a drill. National Weather Service. I felt a chill run down my spine. A tornado. In this weather? It didn't make sense. I opened the weather app again, but it still showed nothing. No storms, no warnings, no signs of trouble. Just clear skies and sunshine. I decided to call the National Weather Service directly. After a few rings, a woman answered, her voice calm but professional.
National Weather Service, how can I help you?
"Hi, I'm calling about the tornado warning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm in Blackvale and we're getting alerts, but there's no storm. Nothing on the radar." There was a brief pause.
Let me check.
She said. I heard the sound of typing in the background. Then she spoke again.
I'm not seeing any active warnings for your area. Are you sure the alert came from us?
"It says National Weather Service," I replied, feeling a knot of unease tighten in my stomach.
That's strange,
she said.
We didn't issue any alerts for your location. It might be a glitch in the system. I'll look into it.
I thanked her and hung up, but the unease didn't go away. If the National Weather Service hadn't issued the alert, then who had? And why were the sirens still going off? I decided to check the local news online, but there was nothing. No reports of severe weather, no explanations for the sirens. Just the usual headlines about local events and politics. It was as if the entire town was ignoring the chaos unfolding around them. Then, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from my neighbor, Linda. "Did you get the alert?" What's going on? I typed back quickly. Yeah, but there's no storm. I called the weather service and they said they didn't issue it. Her response came a few seconds later. That's weird. The sirens are freaking me out. I'm staying inside just in case. I agreed with her. Something felt off, and I wasn't taking any chances. I grabbed a flashlight and some supplies, just in case the power went out, and settled in the living room, away from the windows. The sirens were still blaring, their shrill tone grating on my nerves. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but the alerts kept coming. Emergency alert. Remain indoors. Do not attempt to leave your home. Stay away from windows. National Weather Service. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. The wording was so specific, so urgent. It felt less like a weather alert and more like a warning against something far worse than a storm. Then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched whine beneath the sirens, almost like a scream. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and blending together into a cacophony of sound. It was coming from outside, from the streets. I crept to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtains. The sun was fully up now, casting a bright golden light over the town. But the streets were still empty, eerily so. No cars, no people, no movement, just the sirens and the screams. Then I saw them. Figures, barely visible in the distance, moving slowly down the street. They were too far away to make out clearly, but their movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. They were coming closer, their forms becoming more distinct as they approached. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. They weren't people, not anymore. Their faces were twisted, their limbs contorted in ways that shouldn't be possible. And they were screaming, their voices blending with the sirens in a horrifying symphony of sound. I dropped the curtain and stumbled backward, my heart racing. What the hell was going on? What were those things? My phone buzzed again, and I nearly dropped it. Another alert. Emergency alert. Do not look outside. Do not make noise. They are coming. National Weather Service. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, the phone clutched tightly in my hand. The alert on the screen glared at me, its words burning into my mind. They are coming. Who were they? The figures outside? The ones screaming beneath the sirens? My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the relentless wail of the alarms anymore. The screams outside grew louder, more frantic. They weren't just screams of fear, they were screams of pain, of agony. I could hear them now, clear as day, cutting through the noise of the sirens. It was like the town itself was crying out, begging for help. But there was no one to help. No one but me, trapped inside my house, too afraid to even look out the window. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my hands were shaking too badly to dial. Instead, I sent a quick text to Linda, my neighbor. Do you see them? The things outside? Her response came almost immediately. What things? I'm not looking. The alert said not to. I hesitated, then typed back. There are people out there. Or something. They're screaming. There was a long pause before she replied. I don't hear anything but the sirens. Are you sure? I stared at her message, my stomach churning. How could she not hear them? The screams were deafening, impossible to ignore, unless they weren't real. But no, I could hear them. I could feel them vibrating through the walls of my house. I decided to call Mark again. Maybe he'd heard something by now, some explanation for what was happening. The phone rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. I tried again, but still nothing. Frustrated, I sent him a text. Mark, call me. Something's really wrong. I waited, but there was no response. The silence from his end was almost as unnerving as the screams outside. Mark always answered his phone, no matter what. He was the kind of guy who lived for breaking news, for being the first to know. If he wasn't answering, something was seriously wrong. I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. The sirens were still blaring, their shrill tone drilling into my skull. I could feel a headache coming on, a sharp, throbbing pain behind my eyes. I closed them, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The screams were still there, louder than ever. Then I heard something else, a knock at the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it grew louder, more insistent. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted in. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, each rap against the wood sending a jolt of fear through me. I wanted to call out to ask who it was, but the alert had warned me not to make noise. They are listening. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard a voice.
Please, let me in.
It was a woman's voice, weak and trembling. She sounded terrified, on the verge of tears. My first instinct was to help her, to open the door and let her in. But something held me back. The alert had been clear. Do not open the door. Do not make noise.
Please. They're coming for me.
I clenched my fists, torn between fear and compassion. What if she was in real danger? What if she needed help? But what if it was a trick? What if they were trying to lure me out? The knocking started again, louder this time, more frantic.
Please, you have to let me in. They're coming.
I couldn't take it anymore. I crept to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered through the peephole. The woman outside was hunched over, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked terrified, her eyes darting back and forth as if she was being chased. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, but just as I was about to turn it, I saw something behind her, a shadow, moving in the distance. It was one of the figures I'd seen earlier, its jerky, unnatural movement sending a chill down my spine. It was coming closer, its head tilted at an impossible angle, its mouth open in a silent scream. I jerked my hand away from the doorknob and backed away from the door. The woman outside began to sob, her fists pounding against the wood.
Please, you have to help me. They're coming.
I wanted to help her, but I couldn't. I couldn't risk opening the door, not with that thing out there. I closed my eyes, trying to block out her cries, but they only grew louder and more desperate. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The knocking ceased, the sobs faded, and the only sound left was the relentless wail of the sirens. I waited, my breath held, for what felt like an eternity. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just outside the door. I backed away, my heart racing, and stumbled into the kitchen. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly screamed. It was another alert. Emergency alert. Do not open the door. Do not respond to voices. They are not human. National Weather Service. I stared at the message, my hands shaking. They are not human. The words sent a chill through me. What were they then? And why were they here? I glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But it remained closed, the silence outside almost as unnerving as the screams had been. The sirens were still blaring, their shrill tone a constant reminder that something was very, very wrong. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening. But there was no one to ask, no one to turn to. The town was empty, the streets silent except for the sirens and the occasional distant scream. Then, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Linda. "Are you okay? I think I hear something outside." I hesitated, then typed back, "Don't open the door. Don't look outside. Just stay inside." Her response came quickly. "What's going on? What's happening?" I didn't know how to answer her. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that the alerts were real, the danger was real, and whatever was out there wasn't human. And it was coming closer. The silence after the knocking stopped was almost worse than the screams. I stood in my kitchen, clutching my phone, the emergency alert still glowing on the screen. They are not human. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but there were no answers, only questions, each more terrifying than the last. The sirens were still blaring, their shrill tone a constant reminder that whatever was happening wasn't over. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it remained closed, the silence outside unnerving. The woman's voice was gone, but the memory of her desperate pleas lingered, haunting me. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit here waiting for whatever was out there to come for me. I decided to try calling Mark again. Maybe he'd finally picked up his phone. Maybe he had answers. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then, to my relief, he answered. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "Thank God. Did you get the alerts, the sirens? What's going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Mark spoke, his voice low and strained.
Yeah, I got them. But it's not what you think.
"What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. "What's happening?" Another pause.
It's not a storm. It's not natural. I don't know how to explain it, but something's wrong. Really wrong.
"What do you mean, not natural?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Mark, what's going on?" He hesitated, then said,
I can't talk about it over the phone. Just stay inside. Don't look outside. Don't make any noise. And whatever you do, don't trust the alerts.
"What?" I said, my stomach dropping. "What do you mean, don't trust the alerts? They're from the National Weather Service."
They're not.
Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper.
I don't know who's sending them, but it's not the weather service. Something's hijacked the system.
I felt a chill run down my spine. Hijacked? By who?
I don't know, but it's not human. I've been trying to figure it out, but it's like nothing I've ever seen before. It's like they're using the alerts to control us, to keep us inside.
I stared at the phone, my mind reeling. If the alerts weren't from the weather service, then who were they from? And why were they trying to keep us inside? What were they hiding? "Mark," I said, my voice shaking. "What do I do?"
Stay inside. Don't make any noise. And whatever you do, don't...
The line went dead. "Mark?" I said, panic rising in my chest. "Mark, are you there?" But there was no answer. The call had dropped, and when I tried to call back, it went straight to voicemail. I stared at my phone, my hands trembling. What had he been about to say? Don't what? Don't trust the alerts? Don't look outside? Don't open the door? I glanced at the door again, my heart racing. The silence outside was deafening, broken only by the relentless wail of the sirens. I needed to know what was happening. I needed to see. Against my better judgment, I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, the sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. But there was something off. The shadows didn't look right. They were too dark, too deep, as if they were alive, shifting and writhing like smoke. Then I saw them. The figures were back, but they were different now. They weren't moving in their jerky, unnatural way anymore. They were standing still, their heads tilted upward, as if they were listening. Their faces were twisted, their mouths open in silent screams, but their eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to suck in the light. I dropped the curtain and backed away, my heart pounding. What were they? What did they want? And why were they here? My phone buzzed again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was another alert. Emergency alert. Do not look outside. Do not make noise. They are listening. National Weather Service. I stared at the message, my hands shaking. Mark had said not to trust the alerts, but what if he was wrong? What if the alerts were the only thing keeping me safe? I didn't know what to believe anymore. Then I heard it. A faint, staticky sound, like a radio tuned to a dead frequency. It was coming from my phone. I held it up to my ear, trying to make out what it was. At first, it was just noise, but then, slowly, a voice began to emerge from the static.
Help. Us.
The voice was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the woman from before. This voice was different, deeper, more guttural, almost inhuman.
Help. Us.
I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. What the hell was that? Was it coming from the alerts? From the sirens? Or was it something else entirely? I picked up the phone again, my heart racing. The static was still there, the voice repeating the same words over and over.
Help. Us.
I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was happening. I needed to see. Against all reason, I crept to the door and placed my hand on the doorknob. The alerts had warned me not to open it, but I couldn't just sit here waiting for whatever was out there to come for me. I had to know. I turned the knob and opened the door. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air swept into the house, carrying with it the faint metallic smell of blood. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I could feel it in my ears. The street outside was eerily quiet, the sirens still blaring in the distance, but the screams were gone. The figures were gone. Everything was gone. Or so I thought. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something strange. The shadows weren't right. They were too dark, too thick, as if they had a life of their own. They writhed and twisted like smoke, curling around the edges of the houses and the trees. The sunlight, which had been so bright just moments ago, now seemed dim and muted, as if it were being swallowed by the darkness. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes scanning the street. The houses looked the same as they always had, but there was something off. The windows were dark, the curtains were drawn, and the doors were all closed. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned in an instant. Then, I saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision, and I turned just in time to see one of the figures step out from behind a tree. It was one of the things I'd seen earlier, its jerky, unnatural movements sending a chill down my spine. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, its mouth open in a silent scream, and its eyes were black voids that seemed to suck in the light. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes. Then it spoke.
Help. Us.
The voice was the same one I'd heard on my phone, the same guttural, staticky voice that had sent chills down my spine. It wasn't coming from the figure's mouth. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a pervasive sound that filled the air like static. I took another step back, my heart racing. The figure didn't follow me, but its head tilted further, its neck twisting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Its mouth opened wider, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't screaming. It was laughing, a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers down my spine. I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it, but I managed to slide the deadbolt into place and back away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I pulled it out and stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Emergency alert. Do not trust the shadows. They are not what they seem. National Weather Service. I stared at the message, my mind racing. The alerts were still coming, but Mark had said not to trust them. So, who was sending them, and why? I decided to call Linda. Maybe she'd seen something, heard something. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then she picked up.
Hello?
Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Linda, it's me, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Are you okay? Did you see anything outside? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, she spoke, her voice trembling.
I saw them, the shadows. They're not normal.
What do you mean? I asked, my stomach churning.
They're alive. They're moving. They're watching me.
I felt a chill run down my spine. Linda, stay inside. Don't open the door. Don't look outside. Just stay where you are.
I can't. They're already inside.
The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. Linda's words echoed in my mind. They're already inside. What did that mean? Were the shadows in her house? Were they in mine? I glanced around the living room, my eyes scanning the corners, the walls, and the ceiling. The shadows seemed darker than usual, thicker, as if they were closing in on me. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Then I heard it. A faint, staticky sound, like a radio tuned to a dead frequency. It was coming from the kitchen. I crept toward the sound, my heart pounding, and found my phone sitting on the counter, the screen glowing with another alert. Emergency alert. They are inside. Do not trust the shadows. National Weather Service. I stared at the message, my hands trembling. The static grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from the shadows. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the darkest corner of the room. The shadows there were shifting, writhing, as if they were alive. Then, slowly, a figure began to emerge. A tall, thin shape with empty black eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque smile.
Help us.
It whispered, its voice a guttural, staticky rasp. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't follow me, but I could hear its laughter echoing through the house, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. I slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The laughter continued, growing louder and more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from inside my head. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, my back pressed against the door, trying to block out the laughter that echoed through the house. The sirens outside were still blaring, their shrill tone a constant reminder that whatever was happening wasn't over. The shadows were inside, the figures were inside, and there was no escape. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I nearly dropped it. Another alert. Emergency alert. They are here. Do not resist. National Weather Service. I stared at the message, my hands trembling. Do not resist. What did that mean? Were they telling me to give up? To let the shadows take me? The laughter grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't just coming from the shadows anymore. It was coming from inside my head, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through my skull. I clenched my fists, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The laughter was everywhere, filling the room, filling my mind. I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. Then I heard a voice.
Help us.
It was the same guttural, staticky voice I'd heard before, but this time it was different. This time it sounded desperate, pleading. I looked up, my eyes scanning the room. The shadows were thicker now, darker, as if they were closing in on me. But there was something else, a faint, flickering light in the corner of the room. It was coming from my laptop, which I'd left open on the desk. I crawled toward it, my hands trembling, and pulled myself up into the chair. The screen was glowing with a strange, static-filled image, like a corrupted video file. The voice was coming from the speakers, faint but unmistakable.
Help us.
I leaned closer, my heart pounding. The static on the screen began to shift, forming shapes, figures. I squinted, trying to make them out, and realized with a jolt that they were the same figures I'd seen outside, the same twisted, unnatural shapes with empty black eyes and mouths open in silent screams. But there was something different about them now. They weren't moving in their jerky, unnatural way anymore. They were reaching out toward me.
Help us.
The voice repeated, more urgent this time. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What did they want? Why were they asking for help? And why were they here? Then it hit me. The alerts, the sirens, the shadows. It was all connected. The alerts weren't warnings. They were commands. The sirens weren't alarms. They were a signal. And the shadows were the key. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the emergency alert system. The messages were still coming, one after another, each more urgent than the last. Emergency alert. Do not resist. They are here to help. National Weather Service. Emergency alert. The shadows are your salvation. Do not fear them. National Weather Service. Emergency alert. Let them in. Let them save you. National Weather Service. I stared at the messages, my hands shaking. Let them in? Let them save me? What did that mean? The laughter in my head grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't laughter at all. It was static. The same static I'd heard on my phone, the same static that was coming from the laptop. It wasn't just noise. It was a voice, a message.
Help us.
I looked back at the laptop screen. The figures were still there, their twisted forms reaching out toward me. But now I could see something else, a faint, flickering light behind them. It was weak, barely visible, but it was there, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the screen. The static surged, the figures shifted, and for a moment I felt a connection, a link between me and them. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to communicate.
Help us.
The voice said again, more urgent this time. I closed my eyes, focusing on the static, on the voice. And then I understood. The shadows weren't the enemy. They were the victims. The alerts, the sirens, the figures outside. They were all part of something bigger, something beyond my understanding. The shadows were trapped, just like me, and they were trying to break free. I took a deep breath and stood up, my hands still trembling. The laughter, no, the static, was still there, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt familiar, like a voice I'd known all along. I walked to the door and unlocked it, my heart pounding. The shadows were waiting on the other side, their twisted forms shifting and writhing in the darkness. But this time, I didn't feel fear. I felt resolve. I opened the door. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in their cold, dark embrace. The static grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. And then, everything went black.